To them, he was just government property, a war dog meant for another mission. But to the broken soldier and a silent child, he was everything. When danger crept into the courtroom, Shadow didn't wait for orders. What he did next, no one saw coming. Snow fell in heavy silence over Kalispell, Montana, blanketing the quiet town in a hush that softened the edges of every sound. The courthouse, an old brick building standing with a kind of weary dignity on Main Street, wore a crown of white upon its roof, icicles clinging to the eaves like frozen sentinels. The American flag flapped half-heartedly in the wind, brittle from the cold. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The hush of snow mirrored by the courtroom's quiet tension. Eli Turner sat in his wheelchair at the front of the courtroom, his back straight despite the discomfort that crawled up his spine. At 38, Eli looked older than his years. His square jaw, usually clenched with quiet resolve, bore a few days' worth of stubble. His short brown hair, peppered with premature gray, framed a face hardened by both desert wind and memory. A scar ran jaggedly from his left temple down to the corner of his jaw, souvenir of a firefight outside Kandahar. He wore his army-issued wool coat like armor, not against the cold, but against the invisible weight pressing down on his chest. At his side, sitting as still as stone was, Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd, bore the composed poise of a seasoned soldier. His black and tan coat gleamed under the courtroom's harsh lights, every muscle under his frame tuned to alertness. His amber eyes scanned the room with quiet calculation, never resting too long in one place. His ears twitched subtly to every creak of wood and whisper of fabric. Bred for military service and trained for precision, Shadow was not merely a dog. He was a living memory of war, of camaraderie, and to Eli of salvation. Years ago, when shrapnel tore through Eli's legs and the world dimmed into blood and dust, it was Shadow who pulled him from the collapsing trench, and in the lonely nights that followed, back on American soil, it was Shadow's steady breath that kept Eli tethered to the world of the living. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, townsfolk crowding the wooden benches in thick coats and scarves, steam rising from their mouths as they whispered among themselves. Some had come out of support, others out of curiosity. Kalispell was a small place, and word of the unusual hearing had spread like brushfire. Everyone knew the story. A soldier and his dog and the government threatening to take the dog away. Presiding over the case was Judge Meredith Klein. In her mid-60s, she was tall and wiry, with tightly pinned silver hair and stern gray eyes that peered through wire-rimmed glasses. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor, she was respected and occasionally feared. Her voice, when it rang out, carried the weight of certainty. "Mr. Turner," she said, eyes fixed on Eli, "this hearing concerns the reassignment of military working dog Shadow. You may make your case." Eli nodded once. "Your Honor," he said, voice gravelly but clear, "I know Shadow is government property. I know the rules. But Shadow isn't just a dog. He's not just a tool. He's my partner, my family." There was a stillness in the room, the kind that comes when a man speaks not from duty, but from truth. Eli leaned forward slightly. "He saved my life more than once overseas, and when I came back broken in more ways than one, Shadow was the only one who stayed. When I couldn't sleep, when I couldn't speak to anyone, he was there. He didn't need words, he knew. And he stayed in the front row, sat Bobby Lane, a small boy of 10 with wide brown eyes and a mop of curly hair. Bobby wore a thick winter coat with the zipper half undone and clutched a soft gray beanie in both hands. Bobby had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when he was just a toddler, and since then words had often failed him. Most days he floated in his own world, communicating with the gestures, or not at all. But something had changed the day he met Shadow with Shadow. Bobby reached out. Not just physically, though. The first time he laid a trembling hand on Shadow's head had made his mother cry, but emotionally. He smiled, he laughed, he spoke. Bobby was there today, not because he understood legal arguments, but because he knew his friend might be taken away. And now, as the courtroom held its breath and the law was debated, Bobby didn't move. He didn't look around or fidget like other children might have. His gaze remained locked on Shadow, unblinking, solemn. It was the look of someone already bracing for loss. To Bobby, losing. Shadow wouldn't just mean the absence of a dog. It would mean silence again. A silence deeper than words. Near the back, Clara Morgan stood watching. She was in her early 30s, tall and poised with a quiet strength. Her long red hair was tied back in a neat twist, and her green eyes were sharp beneath arched brows. Clara had a past woven tightly into the fabric of war. Her older brother, Sergeant Dean Morgan, had died in Iraq. When she learned that a military dog was about to be removed from a disabled veteran, something in her ignited. A public defender by trade, Clara had taken Eli's case pro bono. Her expression now was unreadable, though her hands were balled into fists at her sides. The Army's case was presented by Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Harris, a short, compact man with thick shoulders and a tight jawline. His buzzed white hair and impeccable uniform made him look more like a recruiter than a field officer. He stood with practiced confidence and addressed the judge. "Your Honor. Military working dog Shadow is a valuable asset. His reassignment has been deemed necessary for national defense. Emotional ties, however meaningful, cannot override operational requirements." There was a collective murmur through the courtroom. Judge Klein raised her gavel but didn't bring it down. She glanced at Eli, then at Shadow. Her eyes briefly flickered toward Bobby, who still hadn't moved, his wide eyes glassy with the weight of what was unfolding. In that moment, something shifted, not in volume or sound, but in presence. The room was still, but the center of gravity had moved. Not toward the judge, nor toward the decorated colonel, or the law books laid open on mahogany tables. It had moved toward a child in a too-big coat, silently watching a dog who had once made the world feel safe. The judge exhaled and leaned slightly forward. "I will review the statements and make a decision within the hour," she said. "Court is in recess." As people began to stand and shuffle, Eli remained seated, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's head. The dog didn't move. Neither did Bobby. Their stillness was more telling than any argument made. And though no alarms rang and no shadows crept through the doors, a different kind of unease lingered in the room, the quiet kind that comes before heartbreak. The desert heat was unlike anything Eli Turner had ever experienced before. It clung to the skin and clawed at the lungs, dry and merciless. The sun, a blinding eye that never blinked. It was 2016 in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, a place where the air always seemed on edge, as if holding its breath for the next explosion. Eli had been deployed for 6 months, his unit tasked with route clearance and intelligence retrieval in one of the most volatile regions in the South. By then, he had already learned that war wasn't the noise of gunfire. It was the silence just before it. Eli had been leaner, then his face unlined and eyes still holding something close to trust. He was respected by his team for his steadiness under pressure and his uncanny ability to read terrain like a second language. At 6 feet with a compact build and unshakable calm, Eli was the kind of man others instinctively followed. But even he hadn't been ready for that morning. It started with a routine patrol on the outskirts of Sangin Valley. His squad, Echo 9, had been moving along a narrow dirt path lined with dry brush and scattered rock, the kind of place ideal for ambushes. Leading the unit was Sergeant Renee Hartley, a short, wiry woman with the kind of voice that carried even over rotor blades. Her skin was tanned and weathered, her dark hair tucked beneath her helmet. Hartley had a reputation for saving lives by the inch, and was infamous for her zero-tolerance approach to shortcuts. She walked with a slight limp, a remnant of a roadside IED from her first tour, but her mind was sharper than a scalpel. It was Hartley who gave the order to halt when the new dog team joined them, Corporal Jensen and his partner Shadow. At that time, Shadow was younger, barely 3 years old, his black and tan coat still vibrant, his steps quick and eager. He was already considered elite among MWDs, military working dogs trained in bomb detection, enemy tracking, and silent signaling. What made Shadow different, according to Jensen, was his intuition. He read situations faster than most humans. Corporal Jensen was a rangy man in his 20s with straw-colored hair and a grin that came easy. He walked like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. He spoke more to Shadow than to the team, often referring to the shepherd as his better half. It didn't take long for Eli to notice that Shadow didn't follow orders so much as anticipate them. He moved like a shadow himself, quiet, controlled, deliberate. The patrol had just resumed when it happened. Shadow stopped cold, his body stiffening, ears perked, nose lifted into the air. Jensen gave a soft signal with 2 fingers, but the shepherd didn't budge. His front paw hovered slightly off the ground. Classic alert posture. Eli, several meters behind, felt his stomach clench. "Hold," Hartley ordered. That's when they saw it, half buried in the dirt, disguised beneath loose gravel and a sun-bleached cloth. An anti-personnel mine, and not just one. As Shadow carefully circled his nose, moving in tight arcs, 3 more were revealed in a triangular formation. It was a kill box. The squad backtracked, breath caught in their throats. Jensen knelt beside his dog, murmuring praise. Shadow sat eyes locked forward, waiting for the next move like a soldier awaiting command. Minutes later, just as the EOD team was being radioed in a second explosion, far less contained, erupted from the western ridge. Shrapnel screamed across the air, and Eli felt heat and impact slam into his legs. He remembered the color of the dust before he remembered the pain. The world tilted and shrank to the sound of his own heartbeat. Shadow found him within seconds. Jensen was already down, hit in the neck, blood pooling beneath him. Hartley barked orders, but Eli was fading fast. The shepherd nudged his chest, whined, then gripped the collar of Eli's flak vest with his teeth and began dragging him toward cover. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't quick, but it was enough. Eli regained full consciousness 2 days later in the field hospital at Camp Dwyer. His legs were a patchwork of gauze, and every inch of him ached, but the first thing he asked for was news of the dog. A young medic named Reuben Flores, with coffee-brown eyes and a calmness that never cracked, told him, "The dog's alive. Haven't left your side, been sleeping under your cot like it's his duty." From that moment, the bond was forged. Eli requested to adopt Shadow when the shepherd's handler Jensen succumbed to his injuries days later. It was an unusual ask and required formal authorization, but Hartley herself vouched for it. She stood beside his cot and said, "He saved you once. Maybe he'll keep saving you." Over the following months, as Eli underwent surgeries and therapy, Shadow became more than a partner. He became his tether. The shepherd's presence silenced nightmares, soothed phantom pain, and filled the echo that Jensen's laughter had left behind. Back in the present, the courthouse walls were cold and sterile, far removed from the dry sands of Afghanistan. Eli sat quietly, watching Bobby. The little boy still anchored to the wooden bench like a silent sentinel. Bobby's gaze had not moved. Not once. Clara was reviewing papers in the row behind them, occasionally glancing at the boy with a protective softness that belied her sharp edges. Judge Klein had not yet returned. The courtroom hummed with the low buzz of whispered conversations, but Eli said nothing. He only reached down and rested his palm on Shadow's head, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, the rise and fall of breath, and the steady heartbeat of the one who had once dragged him from the fire. Kalispell's wind had sharpened, slicing through the stillness outside Clara Morgan's law office like whispers of some coming reckoning. The courthouse was only a block away, but the world inside her office felt removed, sterile and stark, lit by the cold blue glow of her laptop screen. The hum of the heater was the only sound as Clara stared at the last page of Shadow's service file, her fingers resting lightly on the edge as if touching the paper could somehow summon what had been erased from it. She leaned back in her chair, eyes flicking toward the corkboard across from her desk. On it were pinned names, dates, strings of yarn, and post-it notes, fragments of lives connected by this one dog. In the center was a grainy photo of Shadow, beside a young soldier, a name hastily scribbled on the back: CPL Jensen. The door creaked open, and Sarah Jennings stepped in, mid-40s with her sensible curls and even more sensible shoes. Sarah looked like someone who packed lunch for everyone and always had tissues on hand. She held a stack of printouts. "Clara, you're going to want to see this," she said without preamble. Clara sat forward. "Talk." Sarah laid down several pages. I pulled archived personnel logs from Kandahar Forward Operating Base during the year Shadow was deployed. There's a mention of him on a list marked Obsidian Protocol that's black-level clearance. Only 2 people in that unit had access. Clara narrowed her eyes. "Let me guess. One of them was Colonel Briggs." Sarah nodded. "Retired 2 years ago. Now working in private security?" I traced him to Bozeman. Clara's jaw tensed. She remembered Briggs' square-jawed command voice like gravel, a man more machine than man. He'd testified during her brother's inquest. Cold, efficient, regretless. "I need to talk to him," Clara said. "Already ahead of you," Sarah replied. "I scheduled a friendly inquiry." He agreed to meet. I told him you're working on a veteran advocacy report. "Half true," Clara muttered. That afternoon, Clara drove across icy roads to a private lodge outside Bozeman, where Briggs now lived. The man who opened the door was, as she remembered, broad-shouldered, still somehow upright. Despite age, his silver hair buzzed his jaw square and clenched. He wore a wool vest over a pressed flannel shirt like a man playing civilian. "Miss Morgan," he greeted, his voice still clipped, and Military Colonel Clara replied, "Thank you for your time." He led her inside to a sparse sitting room, walls adorned with medals and black and white photos. She noticed one in particular, Shadow Younger, standing beside Briggs himself. Her heart thudded. "I didn't expect to see him in your home," she said. Briggs glanced at the photo. "He was my best asset. Clara repeated, her voice dry. Briggs met her eyes but didn't answer. Clara opened her folder. "I'm representing a former Marine, Eli Turner. He's fighting to keep Shadow from reassignment, I know." Briggs said, "Saw the notice." Clara leaned forward. "What was Obsidian Protocol?" He was silent for a long time. The heater clicked twice before he spoke. "Shadow wasn't just trained to detect explosives. We were experimenting with deep pattern scent memory, teaching canines to identify chemical signatures of unconventional devices. It worked too well. Too well. He started alerting to compounds before labs even confirmed their existence. Not just bombs personnel. He once signaled a clean-shaven technician 2 days before the man triggered a suicide vest. The program was scrapped. Too much unpredictability. Shadow became inconvenient. So you buried it. We protected national interests. You protected your career." Clara shot back. Briggs didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fatigue, maybe even guilt. As Clara stood to leave, she looked again at the photo of Shadow beside Briggs. "He's not a threat," she said. "He's a witness." Briggs looked away. "He's a liability." Back in Kalispell, Clara returned to her office and began writing a motion to suspend the military's request, a request to open sealed records under the Freedom of Information Act, and an affidavit declaring that the denial of Shadow's retirement could cause psychological harm, not just to Eli Turner, but to any unit that might be assigned a dog trained for secrets no handler was briefed on. The war Clara had once lost through her brother was not over, and this time she intended to win. Morning in Kalispell arrived soft and hesitant, as if the sun itself was unsure of its welcome. The snow from earlier days had melted into slush, and the town's edges shimmered with frost under a pale blue sky. It was Saturday, and while the courthouse remained closed, the little town stirred with life. Slow, habitual, human. At the edge of town sat the community park, half iced, half thawing, with cracked benches and a swing set that creaked when the wind passed through. It was there that Bobby Lane found Shadow again. Bobby stood near the sandbox, bundled in a navy coat several sizes too big, his small hands shoved into the pockets. His curly brown hair poked out beneath a wool hat, and his boots were coated in crusted salt from the sidewalks. He didn't speak, not even when Maria Lane. His mother urged him gently toward the bench with a nod. Maria was in her mid-30s, with pale skin and tired eyes, her wavy chestnut hair pinned back into a hurried bun. Life as a single mother hadn't been kind. Her husband had left shortly after Bobby's diagnosis, unable to bear the demands or silence. Since then, Maria had balanced 2 jobs, late bills, and lonely nights with stubborn grace. She was kind, but constantly strained her voice, often softer than she meant it to be, and her gaze always half distracted by worry. Shadow was lying on the grass beside Eli's wheelchair. His ears perked, though his eyes were half-lidded in the winter sun. When Bobby approached, the German shepherd lifted his head-tail, thudding once against the ground, not in warning, but in recognition. There was something unspoken between them. Shadow did not rise or bark. He simply waited. Bobby stepped forward and sat cross-legged near the dog. No words spoken. He pulled off his gloves and reached out, letting his hand hover just above Shadow's back. And when Shadow nudged gently against his palm, Bobby smiled. Small, barely there, but real. Eli watched from nearby, his breath misting. He had seen Shadow bond before with handlers, with soldiers, even with Clara in a subtle mutual respect, but never like this. There was no training in this kind of connection. That afternoon the park saw something rare, a boy laughing. Not loud, not boisterous. But the sound escaped from Bobby like light from behind a curtain. Maria had stopped mid-sentence in her phone call to stare. Her hand trembled. It had been nearly a year since she'd heard it. In the days that followed, word spread. Not just about the court case, but about the boy and the dog. Bobby, who had once bolted from group therapy, was now walking side by side with Shadow through the town square. The barista at the cafe, a cheerful woman named Dawn with lavender hair and glittered fingernails, gave him a free hot chocolate and told everyone who came in, "War dog or not, he's a miracle in fur." Even the librarian, Mr. Granger, a tall, stooped man in his 60s with thick glasses and a deep, bookish voice, noticed when Bobby sat through an entire story-time session, hand resting atop Shadow's paw. He mentioned it to the town's paper editor, Eleanor Price. Eleanor was nearing 70 sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous in print. She wore oversized sweaters and always had a red pencil tucked into her graying bun. When she heard about Shadow's effect on Bobby, she didn't wait. By Monday, a headline appeared in bold black ink, "Wounded Warrior's Dog. Heals more than one heart." Clara clipped the article and placed it in Eli's case file. "He's doing more for your case than any lawyer ever could," she quipped. Eli smiled, something soft creeping into the corners of his expression. He always does. Later that week at the local elementary school, Principal Anita Chambers invited Eli and Shadow to a small classroom event. Chambers was in her early 50s, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and a commanding voice that turned gentle around children. Her blazer always bore some odd brooch today. It was a small golden owl, and she'd been one of Bobby's earliest advocates. She had heard of Shadow's effect and wanted the other children to see the same. What followed was quiet magic. Bobby sat with his classmate's shadow, resting beside him like a guardian, carved from stillness. When one of the more boisterous boys teased him, Shadow didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stood and placed himself between Bobby and the child. The teasing stopped. Principal Chambers watched from the doorway. So did a dozen parents. Something was shifting in Kalispell. No one said it aloud, but they all began to question the idea that Shadow was a risk, a threat, or merely a tool of war. He was a part of them now, a healer in places no medicine could reach. The courthouse still loomed on the horizon, and the fight wasn't over. But as the days passed, Eli noticed that when people looked at Shadow, now they didn't see military tags or government property. They saw the light in Bobby's eyes, the laughter returning to Maria's voice, the warmth where once there had been fear. It was a small town, and small towns remember what changes them. It was late afternoon when the snow began to fall again over Kalispell. Not the soft flakes of December's hush, but sharp needles of ice-laced wind that scraped along window panes and drifted in heavy silence over rooftops. By the time Clara reached the courthouse steps, the world had turned gray. She pulled her coat tighter, her red hair escaping from the knot at her neck. Cheeks flushed from the cold. Inside the building was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed under the surface like a premonition. The hearing had resumed that evening to allow the judge additional time to consider the motion Clara filed requesting full disclosure of Shadow's classified service history. As expected, the Army had pushed back. A new representative was sent, a civilian in a black overcoat and narrow spectacles who introduced himself only as Mr. Dalton. He was in his 50s, tall, pale, with a voice like oil on glass. He said little, but watched everyone with unsettling stillness. Clara didn't like him the moment he entered. In the courtroom, Eli sat near the front again. Shadow stretched calmly at his feet, though his ears twitched more often than usual. Eli glanced at the rows behind him and noticed fewer townspeople had come this time. Perhaps the cold had kept them away, or perhaps the mood had shifted, something Clara had hinted at earlier that morning. "There's someone pulling strings." Eli, she'd said, poring over sealed correspondence. "I found a contract request from a private defense firm, Vanguard Solutions." The same firm? Colonel Briggs, retired into guess, who's been lobbying for expansion into canine warfare protocols. Shadow's name had been included in their interest list. Inside the courtroom, the judge entered promptly at 6. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "This hearing will proceed with final statements and consideration of motion. 12B, filed by Ms. Morgan on behalf of Mr. Turner." Mr. Dalton stood slowly. "Your Honor," he began. "The dog in question is still classified under active reassignment. Any delay places potential missions at risk. Furthermore, we question the integrity of the records being requested. Many of them no longer exist in official capacity." Clara rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is precisely why transparency is essential. If Shadow's history has been buried, we must ask why. What is being hidden and who benefits?" At that moment, Shadow lifted his head. It wasn't abrupt. It was slow, deliberate ears, angled posture, shifting nose, tilting toward the far end of the room. A low growl started deep in his chest. Eli froze. Clara turned mid-sentence, eyes flicking to the dog. "Shadow," she whispered. Shadow stood now, body rigid. He faced the back of the courtroom tail, straight teeth barely bared. The last time Eli had seen that stance was in Afghanistan moments before a roadside detonation. The gallery stirred. A woman gasped. Judge Klein leaned forward. "Mr. Turner." "Control your animal," Dalton said sharply, taking a step back. "He's not acting out," Eli said firmly. "He's alerting." The room fell into silence. From the hallway came a sound barely audible, a subtle clink, metal on metal. Shadow's growl deepened. Frank, the older bailiff, stood and moved to the side door. Another guard followed. "I'd advise clearing the courtroom." Clara said, her voice cool but urgent. Dalton protested. "There's no basis for a sharp bark from Shadow. Cut him off." The dog lunged forward, halting only when Eli called his name with military command. The doors were opened. Nothing, just empty corridor, pale lights, dust in the air, but Shadow wouldn't stop. Judge Klein, visibly shaken, ordered a brief recess and the courtroom was evacuated, as the crowd filed out into the snowy evening murmurs, followed like ghosts. Eli remained seated, his grip on Shadow's leash taut. Clara lingered near the judge's bench, flipping through her folder with the fingers that trembled slightly. "This isn't random," she said under her breath. "This happened once before. Remember that file we pulled? The one with the civilian vehicle that detonated days after Shadow signaled it." It was a Vanguard transport. Eli's breath caught. "You think this hearing is being used as bait? I think someone's hoping he reacts to justify taking him back." "As if on cue, mister." Dalton approached from the shadows near the exit. His smile was cold. "Interesting display," he said. "Very dramatic. Not unlike some of his prior alerts." Clara's gaze sharpened. "You knew this would happen. I expected something. He's predictable. Animals always are." Eli stood now, anger in his voice. "He's not an animal to us." Dalton adjusted his tie. "He's a military tool, and sooner or later we'll reclaim what's ours." He left with no further word, coat flaring behind him like a curtain falling on a play. Later that night in the motel, where Eli and Shadow stayed during hearings, Clara brought pizza and case notes. They sat in silence for a long time. Papers spread across the small table. The TV muted. Shadow lay curled on the floor, but his eyes never closed. "Do you think they'll try something?" Eli asked. "They already are," Clara replied. "And they won't stop." Eli stared out the window. Snow fell again, thicker this time. Wind whispering against the glass like breath through teeth. Outside in the parking lot, a black sedan idled for nearly 10 minutes before disappearing into the dark. The morning after the courthouse incident was too still. Snow had stopped falling, but a heavy silence hung in Kalispell, as if the town was holding its breath. Clara sat across from Eli in a corner booth at Tilly's Diner, her fingers curled around a coffee mug gone cold. The air inside buzzed with murmurs, but no one came close. Everyone knew something was happening. They just didn't know what. Shadow lay beneath the table, his eyes never fully closing, his ears twitching at the sound of every passing car. Tilly, the silver-haired waitress who'd worked there longer than most buildings had stood, refilled their cups with the grace of someone who heard more than she let on. "Your dog's been the talk of town," she said not unkindly. "Folks don't know whether to call him hero or soldier." Clara offered a tired smile. "Maybe both." Back at her office, the lights flickered, once, then steadied. Clara powered on her laptop and opened the files Mira Collins had risked clearance violation to send her. Mira, a razor-sharp data analyst with a habit of breaking firewalls for breakfast, had cracked into a cache of shadow files buried beneath the Department of Defense redundancies. It was everything Clara suspected, and worse. Shadow had been stationed at a classified location known only as Site 47, a decommissioned medical facility, reactivated as a covert testing ground for long-range IED triggers. The facility had been compromised. Several bombs with timed detonations had been discovered, but only after Shadow had alerted, not once but repeatedly. Despite orders to stand down, his handler at the time had filed a warning. The result? Reassignment sealed records, disappearing personnel. One name stood out: Major Thane Rourke. He had been in charge of the operation, highly decorated, mysteriously retired. Now listed as a consultant under the alias Thomas R. Kane at Vanguard Security Solutions, the same firm now pressuring to reclaim. Shadow. Clara read the redacted report again. One line caught her breath. Subject: Canine demonstrated pre-trigger behavior. Pattern recognition. Inconsistent with current models. Recommend reclassification under Threat Assessment Protocol, Omega clearance required. She knew what that meant. Shadow had sniffed out something human intelligence couldn't, and that made him a risk. That afternoon, Clara drove to Eli's motel room. It was a modest space dimly lit and heavy with the scent of snow-soaked fabric. Shadow stood when she entered tail, still gaze-piercing. Eli looked up from the table where discharge papers and court orders lay, like old wounds reopened. Clara set her laptop down. I found Site 47. Eli raised an eyebrow. You were right, she continued. He wasn't just on patrol. He was warning them before things went wrong. They didn't listen. They covered it up. Eli's jaw tightened, and now they want him back. Clara nodded. Because he's the only witness left. Sarah, who had come along to help draft emergency motions, spoke from the corner. She was bundled in her usual knit cardigan, her soft voice layered with controlled panic. There's more. A letter arrived this morning. From the Department of Homeland Security, not just the DoD, they're issuing a classified retrieval order. No court ruling. No more hearings. Eli stood fists clenched. They want to disappear him. They won't, Clara said. Not without going through us. That night, Clara worked late in her office, surrounded by document-sealed envelopes and a trail of half-eaten takeout boxes. She had drafted a counter-motion, a civilian injunction based on the Public Oversight and Federal Custody Act. Risky. But it would force the court to examine the government's motives in the open. Outside her office window, a black car passed slowly for the second time. The headlights didn't flicker. Kalispell woke to an uncertain gray, the kind of sky that could break into snow or sun with equal chance. The courthouse loomed against it like a silent witness, its old columns streaked with moisture and salt from the season's toll. Inside, everything was set for the final hearing, at least on paper. Clara moved through the courtroom with clipped focus, her files tucked against her chest like armor. Her hair loosely pinned framed a face sharpened by days of pressure and nights of planning. She passed Sarah, who was already seated at their table, her cardigan buttoned high, glasses, low, typing furiously into her laptop. Something in Sarah's stillness, normally a source of calm, felt different today. More watchful. Eli was wheeled in by one of the deputies, blanket across his lap. Coat zipped all the way up. His face was paler than usual, but his eyes burned with the steady resolve he'd carried since Kandahar. Beside him, Shadow paced, once, then settled. His ears swiveled. His nose worked the air. The benches filled faster than usual. Not just with townsfolk, though plenty had come, but reporters too. Local ones, mostly though. Clara spotted a freelance stringer from Missoula with a telephoto lens and a notebook full of sharp questions. The buzz wasn't just about a veteran and his dog anymore. It was about something larger, something unspoken. Bobby Lane sat quietly beside his mother, Maria. He wore his lucky sweater green with a small tear at the shoulder, and he hadn't let go of Shadow with his eyes since they entered Maria. Ever vigilant, kept a protective arm curled near his shoulders, but even she couldn't disguise the worry tightening her mouth. Judge Klein entered right on time. Her expression was unreadable. She sat, shuffled her notes, then gave a slow nod to Clara. "You may proceed." Clara rose. Her voice was steady, measured. "Your Honor, we submit that removing Shadow not only violates moral precedent but fails to acknowledge his unique role within this community as a military canine. Yes, but more importantly as a living connection to healing and protection. He is no longer just property, he is—" Shadow stood abrupt, ears pinned, head turning sharply. Clara froze. Shadow's growl was low but unmistakable. His stance shifted weight forward, body tense. Eli felt it immediately. "Shadow," he whispered, not as a command but a question. The dog's gaze locked not on the gallery but on the far wall where an access panel sat, half concealed behind a judge's flagstand. Then the smell came, acrid, metallic. Burning, Maria stood. "Do you smell that?" The courtroom held its breath. Shadow barked aloud, urgent, then lunged. He pulled free of the slack leash and darted across the aisle, teeth bared, not in aggression, but alarm. He clawed at the panel. Frank, the bailiff, rushed forward. "Back. Everyone back." Clara grabbed Maria's arm. "Get Bobby out. Now." The panel sparked. Blue fire crackled against wood. A small explosion, not enough to bring down walls, but enough to blow. The power, lights flickered, died, smoke rose. Screams started. Shadow barked again and herded Bobby toward the door, teeth flashing not at people but at the dark. The boy followed without hesitation. The evacuation was chaotic, but no one was seriously hurt. Outside, fire crews swarmed the building. One firefighter, a tall man named Cooper, with soot already smudged across his helmet, knelt beside Eli as he was helped from the courthouse. "Your dog," he said, "might have just saved this whole damn wing." News traveled fast. Within hours, the footage from inside captured by a courtroom livestream was circulating on social media. A local reporter posted it under the headline, "Shadow Alerts to Hidden Electrical Fire Saves Dozens." By nightfall, Kalispell's streets buzzed with the same sentence over and over. He did it again. Eli sat in his motel room, watching the video silently. It wasn't the fame. It wasn't the headlines. It was Bobby. The way the boy moved without fear, the way he trusted Shadow entirely. Clara sat beside him, a silent glass of water in her hands. "They still haven't pulled the federal order," she said quietly. Eli didn't speak. "But this," she nodded at the screen, "this changes something. Not in Washington. Not yet, but here in Kalispell where it mattered most." Shadow was no longer a question. He was an answer. The air in Kalispell was different that morning. Crisp, but no longer cold. The clouds parted to let sunlight dapple across the courthouse lawn, turning the icicles hanging from the eaves into tiny prisms. There was no announcement, no media swarm, no official parade, and yet the energy in town whispered of something sacred, a victory that needed no fanfare. Inside the courtroom, silence reigned until the moment Judge Meredith Klein entered. She walked slower than usual, as though the weight of what she was about to say deserved measured steps. Her silver hair was more unruly than before, and her glasses slid down the bridge of her nose as she settled behind the bench. She didn't look at the gallery, not at Clara, not at Eli. She looked at Shadow. The dog, ever poised, sat beside Eli's chair with ears alert, eyes calm. He had been groomed for the day, his coat brushed until it gleamed in the light streaming through the window. He didn't move when the judge cleared her throat. "This court has reviewed all documentation testimony and the events that have transpired." Klein began. "We have considered not only the legal precedent but the moral, communal, and emotional significance of the case." Eli sat motionless, One hand resting gently on Shadow's head, Klein continued. The request from Homeland Security for the immediate reassignment of the military working dog, known as Shadow, is hereby denied. The words landed not like a gavel, but like a benediction. Murmurs swept the courtroom. Some clapped, others wept silently. Maria Lane, sitting behind Clara, let out the breath she'd been holding since the first hearing. Bobby beside her blinked up at the judge and then leaned against his mother, whispering something no one else heard. Judge Klein looked at Eli. Now, Mr. Turner, Shadow is hereby released from military reassignment and remains under your permanent care as both a registered support animal and a recognized contributor to public safety. Eli didn't respond with words. He simply leaned forward and touched his forehead to Shadow's eyes closed. Shadow licked his chin once and soft and sure. Clara turned, caught Sarah's eye. The assistant, who had watched the entire battle unfold while quietly managing documents, court filings, and coffee emergencies, smiled just slightly and dabbed at her eyes with a folded tissue. The cardigan she wore today had tiny embroidered flowers on the sleeves, a gift from her late mother. She'd chosen it this morning because, as she said, today feels like something needs to bloom. Outside the courthouse, townsfolk gathered. Some had signs, Kalispell. Thanks you, Shadow our hero. Wares, fur, not, medals. Dawn, the lavender-haired barista, handed out free muffins shaped like dog paws. Mr. Granger from the library handed Bobby a book because of Winn-Dixie with a sticky note that read, "For your story, too." Reporters were kept at bay by Frank the bailiff, who had grown unusually protective of Eli and Shadow. "Let them have this moment," he said gruffly, standing squarely in front of the steps. Later that afternoon, Clara, Eli, Bobby, and Shadow walked through the park as the last snow melted beneath their feet. Clara had taken off her blazer, revealing a simple maroon sweater beneath, and carried a thin folder tucked under her arm. "What's that?" Eli asked. "Final paperwork," she said. "It's over. No more hearings, no more motions. Shadow's yours. Forever." Bobby skipped a few paces ahead, then stopped and turned. "Can Shadow stay with us forever, too?" Clara looked to Eli, who glanced down at the dog by his side. Shadow barked once short and sure. Eli smiled. "That's the plan." They passed by the playground where Bobby had once stood alone, too afraid to speak, too unsure to connect. Now he climbed the first rung of the jungle gym, his voice clear as he called. "Shadow, watch me." The dog trotted forward and sat at the base, head-tilted eyes following Bobby's every move. That evening, they had dinner at Clara's, a small house on the edge of town with creaky floorboards and a porch swing that swayed in the wind. Sarah brought homemade chili and a pie too big for the table. Bobby fed Shadow small bites of cornbread under the table, laughing when the dog gently bumped his leg for more. There were no toasts, no grand speeches, but when the fire crackled in the hearth and the laughter fell to a comfortable silence, Clara glanced around the room at Eli resting back in his chair, at Bobby curled beside Shadow, at Sarah knitting quietly in the corner, and felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't victory. It was family. Sometimes God sends miracles not in thundering voices or burning bushes, but in the quiet loyalty of a dog, the gentle trust of a child, and the courage of those who refuse to give up on one another. Shadow was more than a war dog. He was a vessel of grace, a guardian sent not just to save lives but to heal broken ones. In a world often loud with division and fear, this story reminds us love can come with fur. Healing can be silent, and faith often looks like staying by someone's side when everyone else walks away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in goodness again. Leave a comment to tell us how Shadow's journey inspired you. And if you believe that God still works miracles through the most unexpected messengers, comment, Amen. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our growing family of hope. May the Lord bless everyone watching this video with peace protection and the courage to never walk away from someone who needs love.